are able to establish linkage between two different locations on the earth, and that is again very in a very promising manner. These are used to communicate things, not only entertainment but also in the hour of emergency. Then you have unique set of satellites which are generally called as GPS satellites, and they are basically global navigation satellite systems which are helpful to identify location with respect to latitude, longitude, and also altitude from mean sea level, generating data set, and also doing some real time, addressing some real time problems. So what you see today, you have satellites in different orbits, geostationary orbit, roughly 36,000 kilometer, GPS orbits, 20,200 kilometer, and our remote sensing satellites, polar orbit, sun synchronous orbit, which is roughly from 600 to 1,000 kilometer. And then you have R&D orbit, which keeps on bringing in newer kind of, technology. The beauty is most of these satellites, if passive, they work on the part of Earth which is illuminated by sunlight, but there are technologies which are also said to be as active remote sensing, which work day and night. So in a sense, you get a beautiful coverage of entire Earth. In disaster, though people were trying to develop their own set of applications, but United Nations General Assembly, it played a very important role by establishing a platform which was on space-based information system for disaster management and emergency response. Generally, we call it UN Spider. So this was constructed with a philosophy that it will provide a gateway, bridge, or facilitator, right from data generation, data capturing, data dissemination, data sharing, and also capacity building, so that institutionals could be strengthened to use this technology in a much more promising manner. And we have plenty of examples to look at this. Probably when this technology started, everybody was running away from this, and we had some of the very well-known examples in the country as well, wherein in spite of having technology and knowledge of this science, maybe we were not able to utilize it its potential manner. Odisha cyclone is one of wonderful examples. There are some connections with Kedarnath tragedy also, wherein these kind of tools, technologies were communicating. People always thought this is very costly affair, but talk to the people who actually use it, you will get to understand that over the time and over the space, as you use this technology, potentially the cost comes to almost negligible in comparison to services which it is able to give. And today you have wide range of spatial resolutions, right from 25 centimeter in Cartosat 3, 2 kilometers in MODIS or AVHHR. So you get all different type of spatial resolutions, different data sets, which could be used as a standalone or could be merged, fused together to generate information as good as 3D models, what we call digital terrain mapping or digital terrain modeling. So that kind of flexibility come facility is available. In addition to remote sensing, there comes a platform or a system which is called as GIS, Geographical Information System, which is able to capture, store, analyze, forecast, look into different type of analysis using the data sets which are generated in raster or vector format. So remote sensing provides one of the inputs to this. GPS can help you to generate data sets for this, and your all legacy database, cadastral maps, and the data sets which are there in files and documents here and there, one should be able to digitize those things into a GIS environment. So many a times, people feel GIS is a map making exercise. But again, talk to people who actually know, understand, and live with this technology. They will tell you that it is a real-time problem-solving kind of platform, and one should be able to do something more than imagination at times. GPS, GNSS, as I told you earlier, it is another set of satellites which are basically helping you to provide you information on location and also tracking. The good news is the technology which started with the United States way back in early 1960s, now it has matured to a level wherein most of the countries, including India, China, Japan, France, Russia, and entire European Union, they are having their own set of GPS satellites. So the technology which was relying only on 24 satellites, today you get to see that you have close to 100 satellites, and which are providing you well closed network so that you don't miss information at any part of the earth. So what people should do, and people are doing, people are using this remote sensing, GPS, GIS, communication, and GIS platform in a much more integrated manner, so that things could be mapped, things could be monitored, things could be tracked, and things could be communicated, and make the community much more capable to address many of the things. So one of the turning point in use of remote sensing is tsunami, which we got somewhere in 2002. So then what people got to understand is that when you have these satellites, many a times they are not able to see the location which you are interested in. So then there were some modulations in the technology, so that anywhere at any given time, if any disaster is happening, you should be able to rework on these orbits or their movements, so that you can capture the information in the almost real time. So this December 2004 tsunami, it gave a greater lesson, not only in terms of how technology should be looked at, also in terms of how applications could be developed, looking at what human life casualties are there, what kind of resources like mangroves, which are very unique in nature, those are degraded, and how land use change is basically affecting many of the other things. And as a result of that, you see in country you have INCOIS, which is able to monitor this. So I can give you a whole range of list with all the disasters, whether it is Latur, whether it is Bhuj, whether it is landslides in Uttarakhand, or forest fires in central India. So a whole range of applications are there. The most recent one which you see is Chamoli, wherein at the behest of Indian Institute of Remote Sensing, using relatively high resolution data, people were able to identify actually the cause which was there, and even the dimension of that, and even the fan where it has actually put its impact. So it was a very unfortunate event, but still, technology was able to tell us. But here I am not to tell you that technology is being used. Rather, I wish to tell you that technology has much greater potential. What we know about these glaciers and all is, from one of the studies, it says that there are roughly 50 glaciers in the higher ridges of this area. And out of those 50, roughly 20 glaciers are very vulnerable. So you need, to use these technologies to regularly map those and assess their vulnerabilities, so that you can see what exactly can happen. Otherwise, we will always be happy looking at historic data sets like of these twin towers of World Trade Center of 9/11, and getting to understand, okay, what was the magnitude of the disaster. And this photograph which you see on the right hand side, it is after the 72 hours of, and that again in accident come attack which was there in those twin towers. So you can well appreciate, come estimate the amount of destruction which has actually taken place over there, and which has affected the city of a country, and which has given a much larger global message. Same thing when you look at forest fires. Again, you can look at pre-fire, post-fire kind of stuff, and you can estimate what kind of losses have taken. But probably we are more interested to know, can we model, can we predict that if given these set of arrangements, a given set of vegetation, given set of climate, given set of terrain conditions, and given set of human disturbance, what are the areas wherein forest fire risk could be? So such type of modeling, it is one of the simplest modeling which I can explain to you, and which was done somewhere in early 1990s, wherein from remote sensing you get input on type and density, from topography you get information about elevation, slope aspect, and from human disturbance you can gather it from road and other things. And then you can integrate them and actually get the fire risk zone or fire risk zone map. So why do you need it? So that you can actually understand where all such type of incidences might take place. More than that, you can do some advanced planning, anticipatory management, wherein you can identify the corridors or fire lines so that if at all such type of incidences are taking place, they shouldn't spill over. So fortunately, we have now something almost real-time kind of monitoring of this, and every day by 11:30, each of the DFO in respective divisions, they get this information. But what about if you get this information, how to mitigate it? Probably you need to understand that if at all there is a fire incidence, how shall it propel throughout the day, so that with your limited manpower and with your limited infrastructure, you can actually check the fires. So what you can do is you can look into the vegetation type, you can look into the terrain conditions, you can also look into the wind direction and other meteorological parameters, and you can actually model it. If you get information at 11 o'clock where all fire pixels are there, then you can hourly basis, you can actually see at what rate and to what direction it is spreading. Like in one of the modelings, we did it till 9 o'clock for the Himalayan landscape and also for the Central India landscape, and we could actually see how it is propagating. So that kind of real-time tools are needed, so that the moment you are informed there is a active forest fire, you should be able to simulate it to understand to what extent and to which direction it might, at what time rate it might get expanded. So that is what technology is giving you, and that is what many a times decision makers are interested in. Same way, if you get any kind of episodic events like hailstorm and all, people generally talk about drought with agriculture, which is much more predictive kind of phenomena. But if you get something very uncertain incidental event, and then you get to understand what kind of losses have actually taken place, put a cadastral map on the top of that, and then you can actually get to know the land holdings or the individuals who have faced the severe loss and those who have experienced the slight loss. And this is what DBT is looking at to do at, direct benefit transfer. So if you know actually if there is a accident which has taken place and it has resulted into some kind of loss wherein compensation has to be distributed, you can very quickly assess these things in a real time and actually almost in a real time distribute the compensation. So distributing compensation is not always the solution. Knowing things in advance is much better, but still post disaster again, at times you need to develop such kind of tools. What probably we want to know in advance is, like in case of Delhi, what we have understood, because of the population density and because of the urban footprint density, we got to understand that the ambient air temperature is increasing, and which is as a result of land surface temperature. So the locations which have excess of such type of increase in ambient air temperature, and so that you can provide something called as green solution, nature-based solution, so that these temperatures could be mitigated. So we have tried taking it forward to look at what kind of green index is there per capita, or what are the options wherein greenery could be increased. So such kind of precursor assessment should be carried out so that a better planning could be done. Otherwise, you will always get to understand that it's not only built up areas, but other locations also, wherein land use, land cover is very dynamic. These microclimate variations will be there, and which will be resulting into altogether unrest in the society. Another interesting thing which often knocks us is, urban flooding, and that happens with most of the metro cities and the cities which are going towards, mega cities, whether it is Bangalore, Hyderabad, unlike in addition to the metro cities of the countries. So even at road level, one should be able to model these kind of things and can actually understand in a given precipitation what kind of depth of the water will be there, or level of the water will be there, whether it is ankle high, knee high, or it comes up to your waist. So those kind of quantitative assessments could be very nicely carried out. So we need such kind of examples so that municipalities can actually get a shake, and they can do some kind of pre-management or pre-planning of their drainage network. So there are ample of such type of examples wherein we have tried, demonstrating how technology is providing you advanced information, including scenario building and also validating our work with a pre-existing disasters and all. So these all things happen because your water bodies or your green areas are getting converted into, concrete areas. This was difficult to say unless, Chennai flood took place. And when people looked at the historic legacy data set of Survey of India and the almost real-time Google images, they got to understand, most of the green areas or wetlands, those have been encroached for settlements, and which is actually resulting into these kind of disasters. So if you can do it at city level, probably you want to do it at country level, and wherein you get to see a problem of multi-hazard risk. It's not just one risk which is at their doorstep, rather there are multiple risks which are, and again, which are bouncing onto society. So one can look at information on what kind of exposures are there at district level, like we have tried demonstrating here, looking at what kind of sensitivity is there, what kind of adaptive capacity is there, and generate information of such kind, which can actually tell you nationwide how exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity is distributed given the multiple risk or multi hazards which are existing over there. So that if you know this thing, you can actually stop having converted each hazard into a disaster. To me, every hazard is not a disaster, provided you know such kind of things, where what adaptive capacity is there, where what sensitivity is there, so that you can actually handle the vulnerability aspect over there. So we have tried demonstrating it using district level data. Now we have done it for the village level data for few of the provinces of Himalayas. And now we are getting down onto the household level. And we get to understand, yes, these things are pretty decent and pretty informative, provided there are takers for this. So to me, people who are into hem of affairs of disaster management and all, they should rely or they should capture such kind of information so that better understanding could be done. So another very interesting thing which is there is, we talk about compensation or giving some kind of financial, benefit. And this is how what we have learned from developed countries. California, the moment you get forest fire, they simply pack their valuables, they put their pet in their car and go to a new city. And after 3 months, come back to the same city and reconstruct their houses. The simple reason is they have insured their houses as well, which is relatively very unlikely in country. Here we take insurance only to save our income taxes, not to do something more than that. So, but time will actually tell us that we need to insure things to transfer the risk. So it is one of the risk transfer mechanism wherein one should be able to take help of this technology. What we did, we tried looking at a mosaic of settlement and commercial area, like your Connaught Place and all, pure industrial area, Narayana, and your pure settlement, RK Puram. And then looking at a very high resolution data set of close to 1 meter, we mapped each and every household. What you see, these yellows, these are each and every buildings, and you get to see these, footprints. Now I know the occupancy of this because I have done a systematic ground truthing over there, interacted with people. So I know what kind of occupancy is there, what kind of height is there. I can do it using remote sensing data. I can validate it going to field. And then I know actually what kind of, height is there, and I can actually assess the stories which are there, then construction type. The moment you get this, flood is one of the hazards which is in Delhi. But apart from that, earthquake is another. So we looked at earthquake, and then we found the kind of exposure and risk. And end of the day, what you get is you get a decision support system wherein you have geocoded information. Each and every house is linked with its address. And then you have hazard database, whether it is seismic, liquefaction, geology, land use, and the vulnerability database in terms of height of building, age of building, or stories. So you click on any of these buildings, you actually get all details related to address and all, plus you get a risk score. So that if you see the risk of your building, you can get into insurance, or somebody who is insuring your building is able to understand the risk and set a premium for you. It is same like when you go for your health insurance. Before going for health insurance, you get for a health checkup. So health checkup of a building so that you can provide a score to this and better things could be done. Plus, we need to provide, with given disasters, such type of distributions. Like this, we did it for Visakhapatnam, wherein it tells you if you have excess of rainfall, the areas will be inundated with water, with the red, orange, green, and blue shades. And each of the resource, petrol pumps, school, nursing home, industries, each of the resources mapped over here. And you know which all your infrastructure is at danger. And other kind of mitigation measures like playgrounds, schools, police stations, and other kind of thing. So if we are able to generate such type of information for most of the cities, probably we will be much more aware of the dangers which we are living with, or the hazards which can affect. Otherwise, this technology is already proven when it comes to broader angles of natural resources like snow and all. Not only snow coverage, but even the type of snow, whether it is a fresh snow, clear glacier, dirty glaciers, or ferns which are over there, so that you actually know how your glaciers are retreating and what kind of impact is there in the downstream, what kind of changes could be there in the basins. Plus, global, along with land, people are also looking at sea level rise, which are as a result of melting of these glaciers or global warming, and then looking at how this is changing and how it is getting translated into changes in the altitude of water. So most of the coast, you can actually identify the coastal areas instead of saying that entire coastline is under danger. You know the pockets wherein you need to take immediate actions. Otherwise, you will always get to see shifts in the coastline. And this is another kind of problem which we are not envisaging as of now, but maybe 10 years down the line, such kind of problems will be there. Most of the coastal districts, their land will shrink because of such kind of variation. Or there could be opportunity that new land is emerging, which will bring altogether different type of turmoils. Plus, the resolution has gone such a high that you can do the head counts. This is, one of the pilgrimages wherein before COVID and after COVID, you could see the crowd mapping. You can actually map how many people and what kind of, gathering is there. And in the world of social distancing, this becomes something very meaningful, that you actually map how people are moving and where those are. This is a wonderful research which was carried out by Harvard, which has looked into the very high resolution data of most of the hospitals in China, and it has also looked into their parking lots and their some of the medical histories. And using this data set, which is triangulated by remote sensing, by health data, and by collecting some other indicators, it is able to say that probably the COVID, which we all get to know somewhere in March in our country and probably January in the entire globe, it was done in much advance there. It was somewhere in August 2019, wherein there was a steep rise in the number of patients which were visiting over there. And that kind of information, unwrapping such kind of newer evidences could be done using such kind of high resolution data set. China is at its own stand. It is not able to accept anything, and even this one. But our remote sensing, analysis kind of things tell you. When we are debating here whether we should call it social distancing or physical distancing, somebody sitting in Colorado is able to actually map people and try to see whether you are getting more than normal or less than normal kind of gathering, so that you can actually see in a city of Denver what kind of crowding or community gathering is taking place. Not only this, each and individual could be very nicely mapped. Now, this is very interesting example, a user of 25 years old and the user of 61 years old. You see this 25-year-old guy is spending more time at home, whereas here in 61-year-old guy is spending equal time at home, work, and other places. So you can actually see what kind of, profiling is being practiced, and so that you can actually ensure what kind of contact tracing is taking place. Otherwise, we often go to John Hopkins website, and this was a trend at one point of time. Every day in the morning, people were looking at this. But now people are probably not interested in this, because this and red one, it is getting as a blur, spot which is everywhere. There is dashboards for India as well. What we are interested to know now is how people are moving from one city to another city. And if those are carriers, so what kind of problems could be there? In what amount, in what speed, what direction such kind of movements are taking place? So look at mobile data sets and the communication network, and especially road network, metro network and all. Developing such type of dashboards are becoming very common. And in West, people are doing it very much. Here also in country, people should look into this, at least from the point of airport, railway station, bus stand, and then looking at where more of a movement is taking place. So looking at time, I have kept very few examples just to give you a overall picture how probably such type of tools and technologies could be exploited in a much more exploratory manner, so that the expected results could be presumed. So today, entire globe is using remote sensing, and this is just a data 2010, wherein you get to see that so many researchers are using it. Why can't we convert this research into something meaningful policy document? So many a times people look at researchers for this, but what policymakers are doing? Policymakers should also marry with these technologies so that they can understand these science and bring back to the planning. This is probably what NDMA was conceptualized for, so that it can do better disaster management, so that the authority can prepare things in much better way, so that national disaster management could be carried out. Otherwise, in a small units and all like this NRSC has its own decision support system, people are generating data sets, concepts, and applications. But we need people to understand and adopt this technology so that meaningful results could be done. From you, probably what I expect is look for more geolocation apps. If you haven't yet put that Arogya Setu app, it means you are not mentally or physically ready for technology. So do it and see the fun with that technology, and probably you will be much more literate. Look at geography, sociology, curriculum, and look it from the map perspective. Bring children into such type of tools and technologies so that better training programs could be developed, better skills could be developed, so that we become better society and better community along with this technology, which is openly, freely available for everybody. But probably we have a degree of hibernation to use it, and we get into our own selves and we feel ठीक है, ये तो remote sensing है. But you can always translate this remote sensing into some application, provided if you take some initiatives. So this was all from my side. I thought I will match the time, and probably I did it 30 minutes. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Joshi. Now, indeed, it was a very insightful lecture for all of us, and I'm sure our participants must have gained a very broad knowledge about this topic. Now, we are going to start with our questions. So, the first question is by Sanjeet Kundu. He's asking that is there any possibility to extract urban heat islands separately from the Landsat image for each land classes? Um, Professor Joshi, I actually recommend you to please switch off your video because it shows that you have a very unstable
Okay.
network.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you get the question, sir, or should I repeat?
Yeah. He is basically looking at extract urban heat islands separately from Landsat data for each of the land cover classes. Yes, it could be done, and you will have to segregate each of the segments separately and compute for that. Then second thing he says, how to obtain the emissivity image for calculation of nighttime Landsat data. So most of the time people have relied on NDVI only, but there are moisture index also, and bareness index, which would be along with vegetation index to compute emissivity. So there is one of the publications in JAC, International Journal of Earth Observation and Geoinformation, wherein moisture has been used along with vegetation to compute emissivity. I will recommend you to slightly look at those papers. And then there are few in IEEE, which tells you how to compute emissivity with the nighttime.
Okay, another question is by Dr. Rachna Mishra. How artificial intelligence is helpful in disaster management?
Well, AI is, everywhere. It's at times goes beyond imagination. Specifically looking at disaster management, the moment you have trend data, which can train your, intelligence and neurons, then people are able to use it. We have examples wherein during COVID as well, the spread and the responses which were from different towns and communities, those were related using AI. So then people have started talking about this in terms of potential predictions and all, wherein AI is being used, whether you talk about landslide, whether you talk about earthquake, or even forest fire kind of thing. So there are plenty of examples. Now people have started collecting information data sets from social media as well to see how people respond to a particular event if all of a sudden it takes place, so that you can actually understand how communities behave. And if you have that kind of understanding, you can take a precautionary measure. The last thing which I will suggest is, if you say something to a community, how does it spread? It spreads with the word of mouth, or it spreads by seeing each other. So therein again, people are using AI to understand how different communities behave, so that policies or any kind of policy intervention, if it is to be taken, so what kind of initiation point could be there.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for your time and thank you for your presentation, sir. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It is pleasure. And now I have a class, so I will have to quit. I am very sorry for that.
No issues,
Thank you
sir.
very much.
No issues.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Joshi.
sir.
Thank you.
Dhanyavad.
Now I would like to invite our second speaker of our session, Professor Girish Mishra, sir. He is working as a professor of physics and assistant dean School of Science, OP Jindal University, Raigad. He received his PhD degree in physics in the field of material science from Central University, Bilaspur, India. He is a member of Luminescence Society of India, Indian Society for Particle Accelerators, Indian Physics Association, and Indian Society for Technical Education. He has more than 25 years of experience of teaching and research. He has published more than 50 research papers in reputed international and national journals and conferences. His main interest involves synthesis of LED phosphors, thermoluminescence, photoluminescence characterization, and uses of white phosphors in LED sensors and dosimetry applications. I invite you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you, Kanupriya ma'am. I am very much thankful to Sarda University and NIDM for giving me this opportunity. Thanks a lot. Good afternoon to all. I would like to start with a very well-known sloka, Yatra Naryastu Pujyante Ramante Tatra Devata. Means, where women are worshipped, there the God rejoices. Uh, Thought not directly about empowerment. It is very relevant because it goes on to say, wherever they are not, everything you do it is fruitless. It is essential to mobilize women's leadership in DRR. We know disaster risk reduction is a fundamental pillar of sustainable development and requires an all of society inclusive approach. Disaster affect men and women and boys and girls differently. A gender perspective to DRR helps focusing attention on the distinct gender-specific capacities and vulnerabilities to prevent, prepare, comfort, and recover from disasters. In many contexts, gender inequalities constrains the influence and control of women and girls over decision governing their lives as well as their access to resources such as finance, food, agriculture inputs, land and property, technologies, education, health, secure housing and employment. Due to existing socio-economic conditions, we know cultural beliefs and traditional practices, women are more likely to be disproportionately affected by disasters, including increased loss of livelihood, gender-based violence, and even loss of life during and in the aftermath of disasters. Consistent advocacy over the last 10 years has resulted in an increasing acknowledgement of the constructive role of women in disaster risk reductions, that women and girls, like men and boys, possess skills and capacity to prepare for, respond to, and recover from crisis, and to manage risk and build resilience. The capacity and knowledge of women and girls play an important part in individuals as well as community resilience. This is an important departure from traditional views of women and girls, an inherently vulnerable and passive recipient of development and humanitarian assistance, promoting women's equal participation and women's leadership in DRR through gender responsive governance at national and local level is paramount as a goal in itself to comply with human rights and ensure that women's voices are represented and their need, their interest, their ideas are brought to the table. A leading role of women in DRR is a key enabler of community resilience, inclusive, sustainable, and relevant solutions to reduce disaster risk for all. So the empowerment of women is a critical ingredient in building disaster resilience. So it has been identified that patriarchal culture as a major barrier which prevent or limit the role of women as decision makers or leaders. Some societies accept that wives and daughters as subordinate to husbands and sons. Traditional systems consider the role of women as mother and housewives and prevent their opportunities in engage in political decision making. Some societies also believe that women are considered as inferior to men, second class citizens, weaker class, child bearers, and care. So, religious beliefs influence the role of women in public engagement, and decision making religions to support the patriarchal society which prevents women's role as decision makers. Studies found that size of the family and its composition similarly affect the decision-making power of women in household, specifically in developing countries. Traditional society expect the role of women to engage only in family work related to childbearing, caring, and kitchen works. Level of education is an individual characteristics. Education is important since it helps to develop interpersonal skills and knowledge, public speaking, and organizing and coordinating activities among women. Attitude of women themselves limit the role of women engagement in politics and public decision making. Specifically, women in developing countries express a negative interest to play a role in politics and decision making, assuming that politics is dirty and involve violence. Therefore, women's participation and their leadership in disaster risk reduction at the social and institutional levels and crucial to make disaster risk reductions activities more effective. Women around the world are paving the way for an inspiring style of leadership that is confident, authentic, and highly effective. It is evident that the countries led by women leaders seems to have been particularly successful in fighting the coronavirus. Whether it be Germany under its pragmatic Chancellor Angela Merkel or Finland PM Sanna Marin, who held a coalition government of different parties, their countries have witnessed not only much fewer fatalities than other countries in their respective regions, but also effectively contained the pandemic. The role of successful leadership are inspiring to the world as a whole and the challenges to many of them face while progressing toward leadership roles. In addition to being focused and clear in their decision making qualities such as empathy, humility, inclusiveness, and the ability to communicate effectively make women leaders well suited for leading the way and inspiring people. The importance and need for women leadership in disaster risk reduction mainly to inspire young minds to be involved and empowered in the society by being an active contributor towards it. So, women are especially hard hit by the social impact of environmental disasters. Existing inequalities are the root cause of women's disaster vulnerability. They have fewer resources in their own right and under their own control. They have no permanent place in decision making system and they suffer traditional, routine and gratuitous gender biased operation. By virtue of their lower economic, social and political status, women tend to be more vulnerable to disasters. To involve women in the disaster risk management initiatives have been taken now. Here I am explaining the role of women in the present scenario and their role in effectively ensuring the disaster risk management. Role of women are important agent for change and need to be further strengthened as such, recognizing and mobilizing their skills and capacities as social forces and to enhance effort to protect their safety and that of their communities and dependents is a major task in any disaster reduction strategy. Uh, if we say think about the Indian women are the backbone of the rural substance economy. Their respective role in family, which is of productive nature to a large extent, makes the family and society sustainable. In rural areas, which are more vulnerable to natural hazard, since rural population depend more on the natural resources based for all aspects of life, securing food, water, and fuel are key community concerns which are predominantly taken care of by the women. They must be empowered to do so effectively. The role of women commonly organize themselves to distribute supplies, establish shelter, and pool labor and resources to create community support services to meet basic family need in the emergency period. Their efforts are invisible or go unacknowledged. Indian women face a number of hurdles in applying and qualifying for aid after disaster. This primarily because of illiteracy or limited literacy, limited access to information on how to apply and navigate the bureaucracy in addition to eligibility requirements. So in my presentation, I have given an elaborate introduction to the topic, the role, past suffering of women in the disaster. Generally, women are looked at in disaster only as victims, despite the fact that the majority of victims in disasters are women and children. The central role of women in facing the aftermath of disaster is totally neglected. India is one of the most vulnerable countries to natural disaster. The country has faced a number of natural disasters in the last decade which have claimed hundreds, thousands of previous lives and heavy economic losses. It has been observed that more than half of the victims in the past disaster were women. During the last major natural disaster of the decade, it has been observed that in Indian women do not have technical knowledge about disaster occurrence in general. That's why the proper training is required. The lives of men and women, the work that they do, the income they receive, the roles they are given, and the relationship that they share, all shaped by our social norms, and so is our traditional, which treats them differently. Truly, in this age of our living, Gender really matters. If the different roles and responsibility ascribed to men and women are socially constructed, then by definition, they may be changed by society, by us also. So disasters are increasing in frequency and intensity. For those lacking control and access to services and resources such as education and information, disaster risks are even greater. While minority groups are disadvantaged in this manner and generally lower socio-economic status and societal norms that limit women's rights. We have also seen throughout the region, women are also vulnerable due to their inaccessibility to information and warning. So furthermore, social or cultural restrictions on women's ability to access secure and sustain livelihoods, which are crucial for coping with and recovering from disaster, put women at higher disaster risk. The women are mere victim because doing so will discount women's capacities and overlook the need for their inclusion in decision making. A proper management of the disaster is the need of the hour. Climate change is the greatest challenge before the global society, impacting the ecology, economy, and society in several ways. Both developed as well as developing countries are being affected by the catastrophic consequences, as Dr. Joshi has said, both natural and human-made disasters. We cannot avoid disasters so long we are living on the lap of the nature, and in this regard, we have no way out. We have to be careful about the disaster, whether it is natural or man-made. A proper management of the disaster is one of the most important tasks left before the mankind. So, what is the women capacity and role? Despite the vulnerabilities, women have capacities for disaster risk reduction, but the society has disregard them due to their subordinate position with respect to men, their ineptness to use physical power, and lack of life-saving skills. They do many things for preparedness and responses to reduce the distresses of their family and help the community continue social function. Women mainly do these as a household level, and their capacity manifests some leadership elements. However, society rarely acknowledges women's contribution. So, the crucial role of women and need of the hour to promote women's leadership. They use their own perspective, experience, and strategies to reduce disaster risk, which is different from that of the men. Beside, half of the population is women. Therefore, women's participation and their leadership in disaster reduction at the social and institutional level are crucial to make disaster risk reduction activities more effective. Two issues are important for applications and promoting women's leadership restricted. Firstly, women's friendly disaster risk management. The disaster risk reduction activities are not so far, hopefully, women friendly. In most cases, activities before, during, and after the disaster creates more workload on women. Secondly, facilitating the environment to promote women's leadership in disaster risk reduction despite the humanitarian agency intention and efforts, discrimination against women in disaster risk reduction, inventions and women's positions and status in the society impede the promotion of women's leadership in disaster risk reductions. Women's work in agriculture is often seen as an extension of their domestic responsibilities rather than a separate economic activities. In rural areas, which are more vulnerable to natural hazard, since rural population depend more on the natural resources. Everybody knows a base for all aspects of life. Securing food, water, and fuel are key community concerns, which are predominantly taken care of by women. Informal community involvement in disaster reductions, but women are still largely excluded from formal planning and decision making and need to be empowered to do so effectively. In case of any emergency system of delivery, they are not properly consulted, although they are importantly involved in family matters at the time of post-disaster, time to aid the entire family. Although women commonly organize themselves to distribute supplies, establish shelter, and pool labor and resources to create community support services to meet basic family needs in the emergency period, their efforts are often invisible and also it is acknowledged. In majority of instances, it has been found that relief and rehabilitation scheme favor men over women, where priority has been given to property owners, tenants of record, bank account holders, and perceived the heads of household. Women's economic conditions become critical because in large number of cases, employment assistance concentrates on workers in the formal economy and business aid is awarded to formal enterprises. The impact of disaster on women's day-to-day work is great. In such a situation, generally support systems such as childcare, schools, clinics, public transportation, and family networks are disrupted and destroyed, resulting in an increased domestic work. That's why women involvement is required. So, role of women in disaster risk management. What are the impacts and the affected people or areas? Women are especially hard hit by the social impact of environmental disaster. Existing inequalities are the root cause of women's disaster vulnerability. Global forces and social changes placing more people at greater risk of disaster also disproportionately impact women. They have fewer resources in their own right and under their own control. They have no permanent place in the decision making system and they suffer traditional routine and gratuitous gender biased systems. So by virtue of their lower economic, social and political status, women tends to be more vulnerable to disaster as I have already said it earlier. So it must also be noted that women have capability which helps the whole family to cope better during disaster. Based on their practical experiences, women undertake preparedness actions but not taken properly. In a disaster situation, women, in addition to their usual day-to-day routine activities, take a lead role in caring for injured person and elderly people. They provide emotional support to family members and collect relief goods, food, and firewood. Traditionally, women rarely receive any recognition from their own family or from any other institution, though in recent years, the recognition of women's role in disaster management has begun to feature in many communities. So, more responsibility is required to involve women in the disaster risk management. Initiatives have been taken now in most of the cases. Uh, they are given the priorities. In fact, women contribute much through their regular activities in spite of their current positions. When all social and economical activities are impeded during disaster and the affected community becomes solely dependent to the external assistance, women institutionally take up an imperative role in order to remove the distress from their families and from the communities. So, in the present scenario, I'm explaining the role of women in the present scenario and their role in effectively ensuring the disaster risk management. Role of women are important in every aspect for change and need to be further strengthened as such. Recognizing and mobilizing their skill is also required in some way. Generally, we have seen and found that relief and rehabilitation schemes favor men, where priority has been given to property owner, the other persons too, as I said earlier. The Post-disaster aid and investment role generally undermine women's collective capacity to surmount day-to-day problems, adversely affecting the economic base of the women. There is no consideration for women's reproductive activity as far as conventional disaster response in India is concerned, which restrict women's security. Day-to-day activities of women during disaster, the impact of disaster on women's day-to-day work is great. In such a situation, generally support systems such as child care, other supports, public transportation, family concerns are disturbed due to these disasters. So it has been noticed that women's groups that participants in emergencies, yeah, resettlement, or reconstruction effort, the communities are greatly benefited by the role of women's. I would like to mention here that in Vietnam and Indonesia, there are examples of women undertaking during and after disaster reflect the majority of literature surrounding women's contributions to disaster risk reduction, response and recovery. Throughout the last couple of decades, the various roles that women play as caregivers, service provider, contributors in pre and post disaster situations are numerous and varied across different global regions. For the couple of decades, the women play as the caregiver service provider contribution. Even some NGOs have done more to support it. Many United Nations agencies and organizations have developed guidelines and manuals for practical applications. So most countries are trying to establish mechanism to enable communities and grassroots organizations to systematically incorporate successful gender sensitive approaches and practices into realistic policy formulation. The women's adaptive capacity goes beyond disaster risk reductions to improve resilience factors such as economic and livelihood activities, social capital, disseminations of information and communication, and enhancing community well-being. The women are significant economic actors who have business that contributes to mitigations the shock of the disaster on incomes of their families. So these are the 6 major areas where the leadership of women's can be encouraged. Women have historically played a significant role in all stages of disaster and risk reductions. The importance of women role in every aspect of disaster management, preparatory, response, and recovery phases, 6 major areas which you see in the slide, where women encouragement is required. Participatory decision making, establishing some mechanism to facilitate the voice and influence of gender equalities, advocate, civil society, and other national mechanism machineries in shaping public policies, making financial decisions, monitoring investment, and DRM institutions. Collaboration and partnership, promoting and creating partnership opportunity for collaborations between women and grassroots organizations, national and local disaster management institutions in the development, management, implementation, and monitoring of DRR initiative. The third one is strengthening women's organization and network, recognizing women network for improved capacity and participation in DRR policy and program levels with particular focus on building resilience. The next one is the supporting community resilience. Knowledge and expertise should be fully recognized and incorporated into risk reduction plans at local and national levels. Engaging men and boys, this is the next one. Men and boys are essential partners in promoting the valuable contributions and leadership of women. The last one is the ensuring women's legal entitlement, providing assistance and services in relation to disaster risk management, such as basic health services, compensation, insurance, social security, credit, and employment are required to be legal entitlements. So, with the disaster becoming a frequent phenomenon, the world is witnessing the increasing and pertinent role of social media during time of disaster and crisis. It has become a vital tool in helping government agencies and other rescue organizations by disseminating information to wider audience. Each disaster finds its space on social media for information exchange and play an important role in DRR by informing and raising the public awareness to the forecasting of disaster so as to enable the women wing to be prepared and well communicated to avoid any sort of disaster. We have already explained the issues to ensure proper learning technology from the disaster, how to survive. Experiences show that in many cases, the system appears unprepared and starts from the beginning. The same problem arises and the same mistakes are committed when a major disaster occurs, though there are a few exceptions. Each disaster is different that needs to be understood properly. So a proper training is required. It is dire need to bring changes in this attitude of society because women are just opposite in reality. They are more aware about the disaster risk resulting this they think about it and adopt necessary strategies throughout the year to mitigate it. Women are able to think about those strategies to face any disaster as they always have to live their lives and manage family with limited resources. Long term and consistent mass awareness through companion is very effective to change this kind of discriminatory attitude toward women. It can be done in two ways. First, the mass education, publicity, community meeting, and the second one, designing program with specific objective to the challenges. So we must think that women are often the drivers, strong networker, managers, organizers, caretakers in the community. However, when you talk about disaster at the highest level, the ones who are talking and making the decisions tend to be men. Imagine if the world begins to release all the knowledge and capacity of the little over 50% of the populations who are women and girls. The return on such an investment would be huge. It has been noticed that women's groups that participate in emergency relief, resettlement, and reconstruction efforts following a natural disasters acquire significant knowledge and expertise that can greatly benefit communities that subsequently experience similar crises. When mechanisms are established for promoting the transfer of this knowledge from community to community, poor women are enabled to come out of their homes and from group to assess their situation, organize and participate in the range of decision and program. This is required. When disasters strike, the opportunity to decrease women's marginalization arise early on. When norms of social control and male-dominated family structure are temporarily disrupted and weakened by the chaos that ensues. If affected women can meet and benefit from the experience of other women who have managed to deal successfully with disaster-related issues, much valuable time can be saved and mistakes avoided. Women have a benefit role to play a disaster relief and reconstruction activities. Considering this, a new approach to disaster need to be developed out of the disaster research, planning and practice should look into their vulnerabilities and requirements. It is my hope that these deliberations will enable practitioner, policy and decision maker to address gender related challenges in DRR and that it will inspire more women and men to join the cause of disaster risk reduction and resilience. That the role of women in disaster risk governance is vital for an effective governance and resilience through which the disaster management will be more enriched and effective as a whole. So, it is accepted that women are not only a valuable role model but also be powerful agent of change at national and global levels. Even though women participate in economic activity, their role in decision making is still at a lower level. The major argument for increasing the role of women in public administration and decision making is due to its ability of enhancing the government responsiveness and effectiveness. This in turn help in achieving inclusive development and democratic governance that helps in improving trust and confidence in government institutions and increasing sustainability and responsiveness of public policies. Furthermore, women leadership ensures inclusiveness of their interest and properly address their issues. In order to enhance the role of women in governance, especially in DRR context, the first step would be to identify the barriers that prevent their role in decision making, governance, and any DRR role. So thanks for your patience for listening me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, sir. Indeed, it was an enlightened lesson for all the listeners. Um, Now I request all the participants, if they have any questions, you can please drop it on the chat box. All the participants, if you have any questions, please drop it on the chat box. Yeah. One question by Ashish sir. How can we bring parity for women at local level in decision making? Sir, are you there?
I think sir has left.
I think sir has lost his connection.
So you can continue with Joshi sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So let's continue with the last speaker of our session, and it's really been my pleasure to invite a very generous personality of our institute, Professor Vinod Joshi sir. He has completed his doctoral degree from Jodhpur University, Rajasthan. He started his professional career in National Institute of Virology, Pune of ICMR, Government of India. Later, he joined as a scientist in another ICMR institute, Desert Medicine Research Center at Jodhpur, Rajasthan. Dr. Joshi has served ICMR for 33 years and retired as Scientist G and Head of Department and contributed important scientific research in the areas of medical parasitology and medical virology. He also served MIT University as professor and deputy director. He has worked mainly on Guinea worm disease, dengue, malaria, Japanese encephalitis, cutaneous leishmaniasis, and H1N1 viruses. In 2009, during the pandemics of H1N1 virus, he established the first reference virology laboratory of Rajasthan at DMRC Jodhpur for undertaking research and providing assistance to State Health Department for molecular diagnosis of H1N1 viruses. Dr. Joshi has published a number of research papers in the journals of international repute. His current research revolved towards respiratory viral diseases, hepatitis C virus, hepatocellular carcinoma, and breast cancer. He is reviewer of many international journals and at present also contributing as associate editor for the well-known journal Transactions of Royal Society of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, UK. So we welcome you, sir. Sir has chosen a very warm topic, a current topic on COVID, as we all are facing this unprecedented time in the COVID era. So we welcome you, sir. And over to you now.
Dr. Joshi, namaskar.
Namaskar.
Welcome, sir.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Dr. Kanupriya, Dr. Abhilash, Dr. Ashish Panda, sir. I'm thankful to you for giving me the opportunity of talking on this important topic, and I hope that this will be of some interest to you.
Sir, please continue. Sir.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
I have to share my screen.
Yes, sir.
So I don't know what
Sir,
happened.
we can see your screen, sir. I mean, you have to open your presentation first in the screen.
Okay.
So thereafter, sir, you can choose your presentation.
Is it visible now?
How visible, sir? Kindly make it full screen, sir.
Okay, thank you. So COVID-19 disaster and its management is the topic that I will be discussing with you this afternoon. At present, the world has faced one of the worst health disasters in the form of COVID-19, and you know the disease is still continuing. A new virus called severe acute respiratory syndrome COVID-2, SARS-CoV-2, has affected 8 crore 11 lakh 59,096 people with 17 lakh 91,246 deaths.
नीचे आ रही है ना, एक मिनट, एक सेकंड सर.
I think F5 करने से भी आ जाएगा. Thank you.
So we are in the era of being exposed to one of the worst health problems of the century, that is COVID-19. A new virus which was not known to us before has affected 8 crore 11 lakh people with 17 lakh 91,000 deaths in a span of 12 months till December 2020. The disease caused by SARS-CoV-2 is known as COVID-19 popularly. First case of COVID-19 was reported from Wuhan, China, when a cluster of the patients from the seafood market were reported with the symptoms of pneumonia of unknown origin. COVID-19 was originated from Wuhan. If we talk about the origin and the spread of infection, it was originated from Wuhan in December 19, and on 1st February 2020, WHO declared this as a global emergency. On 1st February 2020 only, 9,826 cases were reported from entire world, of which 9,720 were just localized in the country of China. Of 106 cases in the rest of the countries of the world, 19 countries outside China, 4 were from United Arab Emirates, Italy, 14 cases from Thailand, and 1 case each from Nepal, Sri Lanka, and India were reported. You can see that how small was the magnitude of the problem when the disease started from China. But the bad point of it is that all who reported infection outside China, they all had the history of traveling from Wuhan to their respective country. Now, if you look at the case, what was the situation on 31st January, you can see the cases were localized only in China and nowhere else. But as we move further, that is, that the COVID-19 cases rose from 9,720 from 1st February to 66,000 in the 15 days, reporting an increase of 56,000 cases in the world. In countries outside China, the increase was only from 106 to 526, an increase of only 420 cases. To start with, the infection had traveled more to the neighboring countries of the China in the Western Pacific and Southeast Asian region than the geographically distant countries of European and African regions. You can see here that to start with, there were hardly any case outside the adjacent countries to the China. On 1st March, we found that in 1st March 2020, the global burden due to corona was 87,000, in which China again contributed 79,000. The cases where the countries outside China reported only 7,000 cases in the period of 3 months from its origin. While increasing the number of cases in China was from 56,000 to 79,000, that's 23,000 new cases. In countries outside China, the transmission was not that fast and increase was of 6,600 cases only. At this time, the infection had been reported more from the European countries such as Italy and Germany. You can see that the cases from the adjacent countries of the China have started going towards the European countries. Ladies and gentlemen, we are discussing the origin and the spread of infection, that how it has originated, because to determine the origin is a must to control the prospective problem. Till 15th March 2020, the global burden due to corona rose to around 1 crore 53 lakhs cases, in which China contributed only 81,000 cases, whereas countries outside of China reported 72,467 cases, a high increase in number of cases. While increase in the number of cases in China was from 79,000 to 81,000 only, that is 1,000 cases only. In countries outside China, the transmission was enhanced and we had 58,000 new cases in the country outside China. At this time, the infection had been reported more from the European countries like Italy and Germany as compared to the countries of the Western Pacific and Southeast Asian regions of WHO. We can see here the clustering of the cases more in the European region from the China. Now, the conclusion about the origin and spread of this disaster is that the COVID-19 as a new human disease had originated from China, number one. The originating foci of the outbreak of the COVID-19 in Wuhan was Huanan Seafood Market. The whole genome sequence study showed beta coronavirus as the etiological agent belonging to a new virus in the subgenus Sarbecovirus in the Orthocoronavirinae subfamily. The genomic studies, which were again done by the Chinese when the infection was started, the genomic studies established that new SARS-CoV-2 had close homologies with the similar viruses from China only. But when it was originated from a particular focus of China, the pandemic spread of the corona was devastating. The coronavirus had spread to 222 countries, covering a geographical distance of 14 crore 89 lakh 40,000 kilometers square in just about 365 days of its appearance. So the virus has established itself as one of the fastest spreading human pandemic infections, leaving no ethnic group, environment, or the socioeconomic strata, was such an impartial virus that it affected all those, and nothing was untouched from its spatial expansion. The fast dynamics of the virus transition has been facilitated mainly by the faster means of travel, and that is air travel, distributing the patient across the countries. The local transmission then came into the picture within each country and then followed up at the huge disease burden has been caused by the coronavirus. The European countries and Iran did not have direct geographic proximity with China, yet they have reported sudden jump in the increase in the new cases, whereas China, the origin country of the infection, showed controlled number of the new cases after some time. Eruption of the high peak of the new cases in the Iran and Europe, the two geographically and culturally distant populations, demonstrate that there may not be a common epidemiological or virological cause of the increased number of the cases in all the countries which have reported infection. We need to study as to what causes the faster transmission of corona in a particular population. Is it more population density like we get in the slums? Or it the habit of smoking or behavior making salivary exchange? Or is it that a weak immune response by an infected human liberates unchallenged virus? Or is it that more number of the samples have been tested in the countries reporting faster eruption of the new cases? There may not be a common reason across all population. In some of the countries, high population density, in some of the countries, smoking, in some of the countries, salivary exchange might have played the role. And we need to study the individual country as a specific disease ecosystem to establish what are the local and focal causes of the disease transmission and then suggest the corresponding control strategies as specific to an individual country to control the prospective transmission. So we have discussed the origin of the corona, we have discussed the pandemic spread of corona, and now we are coming to the transmission of corona. What is transmission? Transmission is travel of infection from infected to healthy person. In mosquito-borne diseases, it is mosquito which does this role. But in the case of respiratory health problems, it's no vector is associated and it depends on how close you are in the range of an infected person. There is a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine that when a healthy volunteer coughs and sneezes, जब वो खांसता है और छींक आती है, the droplets of saliva may be forced to the distance of say 10 to 12 feet. The transmission of the respiratory virus such as SARS-CoV-2 therefore could be possible only within 2 to 12 feet of the distance as far as the primary transmission is concerned. And we may call this as the size of the transmission system of coronavirus. A malaria will be transmitted from the patient to the healthy person in the range of the flight range of mosquito. But in the case of coronavirus, it will be spread from infected person to healthy person only within 10 to 12 feet of the distance where the coughs and sneezes can reach. For the appropriate public health control measures, the knowledge on the transmission extent of the coronavirus need to be explained very explicitly to the public health stakeholders and administrators. Another important issue in the disease transmission is that whether an asymptomatic case can transmit the infection. Although there has been an exclusive report that an asymptomatic case could transmit the infection, yet the observation reported remain to be proved. Asymptomatic cases appear point of core concern also, as to why a case is asymptomatic. It could be due to the strong immunity of the infected person, or due to the weak viral load which has entered the person, or due to a small number or no complete virions present in his nasopharyngeal region, or due to all of these reasons above. So this was all about the origin, pandemic spread, and transmission of corona. And now we come to management. My head of department, Dr. Abhilash Shah, has given me a very brilliant topic, that is the disaster and its management. So the management through specific knowledge generation, management through preventive strategy, and management through curative approach, all these we have to think before we enter the another era of some new virus. Now, management through specific knowledge generation. Now, there are many diseases in which we have the management problem. For example, in malaria, it's no more a problem of generating a new knowledge because everything is known. Insecticide is known, chloroquine is known, everything is known. At the management problem, so the research needed is of the operational type. But realizing the high pandemic spread and associated severe morbidity and mortality of coronavirus, intense and multiple researchable issues need to be addressed, covering etiological, epidemiological, pathological, immunological, pharmacological, clinical, and public health research. Generation of relevant data highlighting existing knowledge, aptitude, and practice among the patients and the healthy population, and producing reliable information, education, and communication material to improvise the key factors to control the ongoing transmission. Through specific knowledge, we can manage our prospective problems, etiology of the COVID-19, the present status of knowledge and prospective research needs, epidemiology of COVID-19, the determinants and predictors of the transmission, then the pathology of SARS-CoV-2, then immunology of the SARS-CoV-2, then the pharmacological studies for the therapeutic molecule, and then public health measures to reduce the virus transmission are the few areas where the new knowledge generation is required. When a new pathogen enters human body, the most important issues are where from it came, how it came, what aided to its entry, what was the route of the entrance to human habitations, and so on. In the case of SARS-CoV-2 virus, we know it was reported from seafood market of China. But that does not ensure its origin, but only its first observation about its occurrence. What is the origin? Our present knowledge on all the existing viruses, ladies and gentlemen, be kind to listen me. Our present knowledge on all the existing viruses teach us that these pathogens erupt from the common belts where the fringes of the forest and human habitations meet together. The close and consistent sharing of the man and the forest animals provide sylvatic birth to such infections, and here lies our primary priorities of research. You have taken the example of the bird flu. We knew in very advance that the virus has come to birds. We started taking precautions. Today, we are saved from bird flu transfer to human beings. Human habitations in each country are surrounded by the fauna and flora specific to that particular country. In Afghanistan, it will be different. In Russia, it will be different. In Switzerland, Sweden, Finland, it will be different. So each of the country therefore represent a unique disease ecological zone. with merging belts of the human and the forest borders containing their own flora and fauna. A proactive and the comprehensive intersectoral research is thus needed for each country to undertake pathogen and serosurveillance of man and animals in joint bands of the forest and human habitations endings. A robust virological surveillance is needed to generate a predictive database for possibilities of future epidemics and pandemics. The mystery of the disease is what? Why we say that it's a mysterious disease? The mystery of the disease pathogens of unknown etiology is nothing but lack of our proactive efforts to know what should be known. Perhaps the time has come when, like weather forecast, we have to generate viral disease forecasting system in each of the country, not when the first human case is reported, but before any case has been reported. These steps are essential to prevent the future pandemics. Now we come to the management through curative approach. The status of the drug is also very poor in the case of uh, coronavirus. Veklury or the remdesivir, actually the antiviral compound which was first um, invented by Japanese. And this is the first drug which has been approved by the US Food and Drug Administration in the treatment of COVID-19, and it has given excellent result. The drug uh, for the adult and pediatric patients of 12 years or more weighing at least 40 kilograms has been recommended for this group. This is as such the ultimate drug available today to treat mild as well as severe COVID-19 patients. If we give the oral drugs, it's not that effective. It's slower than the speed of the virus replication. But if we give the injections, we have seen it in many number of the cases that yes, it has controlled the infection. In addition to remdesivir, number of other categories of the drugs are being tested for their efficacy against SARS-CoV-2, and we have to continue our pharmacological efforts to invent the molecule which can be of therapeutic value. SARS-CoV-2 poses serial clinical threats during its concentration affecting the alveolar or the gas exchange region of the lungs. The most important phase of the virus in our body is when it goes to the gas exchange region of the lungs. We are just helpless, just cannot do anything except seeing a person dying. What we have to do is, in the cases of mortality, we have to go for the histochemistry of the lung cells. The histochemical studies on the culture of the infected lung cells and effect of the various drugs on reducing intracellular viral load in the lung cells should be the priority research to reduce the possibilities of mortality among serious patients. Ladies and gentlemen, my friends, coronavirus is much more a serious virus than the serious attention we are paying to it. We have to be much more stronger. We have to be much more precaution taking, and we have to be much more brilliant to defeat the virus, not only coronavirus, but also the future pandemics, which can be of similar nature. Thank you very much for sharing this presentation. Uh, Thank you, Dr. Kanpriya.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for your valuable words, sir. Um, Now, participants, we have a question round. So if you have any question to the Professor Joshi, you may please drop it on the chat box. Indeed, it was an excellent session. So thank you so much, sir.
My pleasure.
Okay, Joshi sir, thank you so much. You covered
Uh,
nice aspects with respect to the COVID-19, the present status,
Thank you.
and I mean its genesis and things like that. You also covered how to manage through S&T innovations and proactive, comprehensive research and development that is required in this area. And virological surveillance you talked about. I was listening the whole of your presentation. The curative processes and measures you mentioned, sir. Then serious clinical threats related to SARS and measures we need to observe to keep ourselves protected in times to come. Sir, I have one question with you. Where you see ourselves in the 2021 with respect to the pandemics, and recently I gone through one of the interviews of a glacial scientist. He mentioned that because of the climate change, the sea level is rising, sir. So because of climate change, sea level is rising because of glacial melt.
No, I'm not able to hear you because of.
Yeah,
Because
glaciers are melting, sir.
So because of climate change,
Glaciers
glaciers
are
are
melting.
melting.
So lots of viruses
Yeah.
that may have been kept in those glaciers in the snow that will be coming to the ocean, sir. So
Yeah.
how do we see ourselves as prepared for the forthcoming times with respect to pandemic kind of a situation, sir? This was only one virus which defeated the entire globe, sir.
Dr. Panda, I just want to submit that these viruses are not living organisms.
Yes, sir.
These viruses are the combination of living compounds. Actually, nucleotides, which are basically joined together to give the hereditary, they are found in the viruses. They do not have the competence to reproduce, they have competence to replicate.
Yes, sir.
Replication and reproduction has a difference that reproduction repeats the ancestral characters, whereas replication simply ensures the increase in number. My submission to you and all those listeners is uh, the climate change or anything or oceans or mountains and all these, they do not have much impact on these viruses because the virus world is our body. It replicates within our cell and we very efficiently maintain 37 degrees centigrade. So whether the outside temperature is bad or good, yes, you are right in one sense that the transmission may be supported by the environmental factors. There may be more jukam, more nasal secretions, and there may be faster transmission. But to say that the virus is affected by the climate change and all, climates are changing for the centuries. Why the virus is now only? So we have to understand these viruses and other pathogens. You know, we don't have a single new bacterial disease, new protozoan disease, nothing. But we are every year having a new viral disease. Why? Because these are not organisms, but these are the reunion of the sequences which come repeatedly in the different forms. We have to take the hold of these foci, these places where this reunion is taking place. As a scientist, we have million eyes. We can pick up anything. Only thing is that urge has to be there. So we have to go proactive. We cannot suffer and then find the solution. We have to go proactive, catch hold of it before it catches hold of us. Thank you, Dr.
Very
Thank you,
well
sir. Thank you,
said.
sir.
Very well said, sir.
Thank you so much.
Sir, we have another question. Like everybody is actually asking this, that when we are expecting to get vaccine ready, as the virus is getting mutated now,
Yeah.
so how long we have to wait for the vaccine?
Well, vaccine production is the commercial part of the whole scenario. Academically, making the vaccine is not at all a great exercise. But to prove that the vaccine is beneficial and this is strong enough to produce the sufficient titer of the antibodies before infection matter, those that ensuring that the vaccine is very efficient, that takes long time. Taking a vaccine means attenuate the virus, give it to your body so that it produces antibodies without harming the pathological bad effect to your body. That's academically and scientifically not a great exercise, but the trial of the vaccine to make 100 times sure that yes, this is only beneficial and beneficial and beneficial.
दम हो गई कुछ नहीं होता चलो उठो उठो उठो
Um,
Sir, kindly continue, sir.
sir, continue, sir, please. I request Piyush sir to please mute all the participants except Joshi sir. And
Is it over?
sir, we have another question by Shibani Jaina, and she has very interesting question actually. She's asking that as the patients who were suffered from COVID virus, so there is a chance that their DNA must have undergone some kind of mutations. So is there any possibility that they will inherit that mutation from one generation to the next?
मैं कह रहा हूँ ना मैं पूरा वो कर रहा हूँ रेगुलेट कर रहा हूँ
Mutations. See, mutations actually, we come to know about the mutation only when we generate the sequences of a pathogen and put it in the software to see whether this is deviating in the sequence of nucleotides in terms of the standard genome. Now, all the mutations are not significant. Some of the mutations are significant in the way that they will code a new viral protein. Some of the mutations are only point mutations, which are not of the much significance. So that to say that whether mutation will harm or not, mutation will affect the vaccination or not, this is not correct. We have to find out, yes, which type of the mutation, which mutation, this is in which gene, that gene is responsible for producing which proteins. Some of the proteins which virus produces may not be harmful, whether the virus replication will be aided by these mutated protein, then the mutated protein sometimes can also be beneficial. They may retard the virus replication. So, once we come to know that this is the genome which is there in our sample, we go for the whole genome sequencing. My students who are faculties here, Dr. Bennett Angel and Dr. Enid Angel, have done many whole genome sequencing of H1N1 and dengue viruses. So like that, we have to go for whole genome sequencing. We have to find out for ourselves whether the sequences which have been mutated are going to form the new proteins or not. And if yes, new proteins are there, then whether those proteins will affect the clinical condition or not. So you have to travel from the sequencing mutations to the clinical condition of patient, and you have to keep on seeing micro to macro observations to come to a particular conclusion.
Yes, sir. Sir, last question.
Yeah.
What is your view on this new strain which is spreading in UK and the South Africa? So what is your view on that?
See, new strain. A strain is a strain. A strain enters to your cell in the nasopharyngeal region, and that strain intracellularly replicates, and by rupturing the cell, the virions are spread and they find the new healthy cells. And like this linear motion, they reach through trachea to our lung cells. Now, a strain is new or a strain is old. The replication procedure, that is the positive sense RNA multiplication mechanism, will be same. Now, strain may be, you may say it may be resistant towards some drug. In that point of view, remdesivir is killing the strain. If there are many new protein, many significant mutations in the new strain as compared to the old strain, then we may have to revive the vaccine policy and all. But then we have to see new in what sense. If its nucleotide sequence is new than earlier one, then you have to match the clinical condition with the new strain. You cannot say that new strains will have the faster transmission. No? Those who say they are wrong. Transmission will be through the infected droplets from infected to healthy person. Transmission will be same as per the speed of the droplets of saliva. Transmission will not be determined by the strain of virus, but replication may be affected once it enters your body by the strain of virus.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Now I request Ashish Panda, sir, to pay a vote of thanks to our
Yeah.
speaker.
Sir, thank you, Dr. Vinod Joshi, sir. The way you presented your case, it was very lucid, very thought-provoking, and very interesting, sir. I could attend the entire of your presentation, and also the way you handled the questions, sir. So reassuring kind of a thing. Nothing is going to happen. Be protected and things like that.
Dr. Panda, I'm 65 and for 40 years I am doing viruses only.
Thank you so much, sir, for being here today. And also we thank our two esteemed speakers who were there today. Dr. Girish Mishra, he talked about women in DRR, the participative management kind of thing, decision-making system, why we should include women into providing those kinds of platform to them for inclusion in the policy plan preparation, their financial independence, and more women should be there at the job front. Then we should provide equity to them at the workplace, at the home, at the roads, common roads, their health and nutritional aspects and things like that. Their security issues or domestic violences and sexual abuses. It touched upon each and everything with respect to that, and why we need to encourage more of women participation and leadership in all disaster risk management measures and processes in our country. Then we had the first talk of, from Professor P.K. Joshi sir. He talked about remote sensing, geoinformatics, and also GPS and GNSS systems. He spoke about the 50 years of space explorations, the UN Spider mission he talked about, and how these scheme of things, that S&T innovations with respect to these technologies, how they are going to help us in decision making for our policy and plan makers in our country. We have to educate children, he rightly mentioned, for such technology, so that more children will be encouraged to join these kinds of courses. And in times to come, India will be a leader as far as RSGI's technologies are concerned. So we thank all the three esteemed speakers for today's this program. That was the second day of our this 3-day program. And thank you so much for all the participants also for their patient listening. And tomorrow, 14:00 hours, 2 p.m., we are again going to meet for the third and penultimate day for our this 3-day program. Thank you so much. Over to you, Kanupriya.
Thank you so much, sir. So we are about to end our session, and we'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow will be the last session of our 3-day symposium and training session. So, okay, we'll meet at 1:45 tomorrow.
Okay.
I request all the participants to please connect before 2 p.m.
Yeah, 15 minutes earlier they should come.
Yeah, and thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you
Dr.
very
Joshi.
much, sir. Yeah, and tomorrow also we have one talk from Dr. Dilip Kumar Bisi. He is also going to speak on COVID-19. So
Very
he's
good.
using the nanotechnology and the tissue engineering techniques to defeat the to defeat this COVID-19 virus.
Okay.
So we, yeah.
Dr. Piyush, you can also tell the participants about the 2 other talks of
Yeah,
tomorrow.
sure, sir. And there is another talk from Dr. Professor Sher Ali sir. He is going to speak on COVID-19 and the disaster risk management. And there is one more talk also. And Professor Anil Kumar Gupta sir,
Yes.
he is going to speak on Bata, the living entity, applying the spirituality and middle path for resilience.
Wonderful.
So we have tomorrow 3 distinguished speakers. So please join us at again 1:45 p.m. and we will continue our session, and then there will be the valedictory at 4 p.m. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.